to convey this a little bit, I can speculate even a little bit more than Millen was willing to, and sort of where I think it's likely that, like, long term this looks like. And some of that is inspired by, although it's not identical, the case for how you do human interfacing. It's not identical to the question that we asked in the 2013 paper, which was about how do you do sort of complete coverage of the mouse brain activity. But it's related, right? Because basically the big problem with the mouse brain is this three-dimensional centimeter or so thick object. And you have to basically interrogate that object, even though it's opaque, without heating it up, without destroying that object, right? It's a sort of real-time sensing of a three-dimensional light-sensitive and heat-sensitive hunk of material. And the human brain problem is somewhat related. The skull is a slightly different thing than the tissue, but basically that's this constraint of sort of three-dimensional sensing of an opaque biological object. That's basically the question. You're using kind of non-invasive forms of radiation, so light, sound, magnetic fields that can penetrate through tissue. And light doesn't exactly penetrate because it bounces around and scatters, but it can actually go quite a long distance. So light, sound, and other types of non-invasive things like magnetics in combination with each other. Neurons naturally aren't coupling to those modalities incredibly well. So then you need to add in a kind of transducer, and DARPA in a fairly recent program called as a nanotransducer, and that is the thing that couples the neurons to that form of radiation, so that it can talk to them, right? Like optogenetics is an example. So I think there are kind of these couple of big areas that you would push, where at the beginning you don't directly make that BCI system that has all of those things together. This is kind of the technological road mapping part, is that you might need to make big technical pushes on some of the components. How do you deliver the radiation? How do you steer the radiation in this like scattering material? And then also how do you deliver these nanotransducers, which could be done with viruses, it could be done with nanoparticles, it could be something else, but sort of gene or cell therapy, gene or cell delivery to the brain. Initially the non-invasive modality that you would use for some medical application without the nanotransducer might be kind of a big clunky MRI-like thing. It's not a portable consumer product that Facebook immediately wants to put in its AR glasses. It's going to use a lot of power and stuff. But then if you added the nanotransducer later, then that would make it much easier to couple to that detailed information. And so the nanotransducer makes it easier rather than harder to get the information. But then there's this other path, right? You can't do that all necessarily in one company or one effort. And so that's why I think that there's these kind of FRO-like kind of moonshotty projects on these kind of non-invasive radiation, and then fundamental biological kind of delivery and access with things like genes and cells, not to mention the connectomics and the brain mapping and understanding how do you target those genes and cells to circuits. Each of those things to some degree has applications on their own. And so one of the ones that I think is most exciting, where there is a real application, is one that Millen just mentioned kind of in passing, which is ultrasound. And so ultrasound, there's a group out of Caltech that's really pushing it, and a few other groups. But ultrasound, several key things about it. One is that you can create it and detect it using tiny microchips, right? These are micro electromechanical systems. You can make a chip that can vibrate ultrasound. It doesn't have to be a big device. You can have sort of very miniaturized delivery and sensing of the ultrasound on a chip. Two, ultrasound can naturally both stimulate the brain and do things like this blood-brain barrier opening without any genes or cells having to be part of the picture that are exogenous. And it can also see brain activity in a way that's probably better than many of the things we're talking about, like near-infrared spectroscopy or fMRI. And so the question is basically, how do you make an ultrasound platform for the brain today? And the problem there is that sending ultrasound through the skull is difficult. You can do it, but it requires you to have a pretty long wavelength of ultrasound, which means your spatial precision is low. And so if you can instead put the ultrasound emitter detector array, this chip, above the brain, so not touching the brain, which is really good for safety, but inside the skull, then that would be just from a fundamental technology platform perspective, that would be how you could use ultrasound to sort of see the whole brain at kind of intermediate resolution. And eventually you'll have things like ultrasound sensitive proteins and stuff like that or cells that would be the full interface. But that's really powerful even now. But that's another example where, it has certain applications, epilepsy and some others, that are very immediate. But if you want to try to say, well, how are we going to solve depression or OCD with that? You actually kind of need the thing to be in the brain for a while and do some scientific studies to understand how those things work before you can say, here's a sure shot at the exact way we have to use ultrasound to stimulate that. So it's still a discovery platform kind of play, which again is not the traditional kind of product market fit orientation, where medical device companies basically require you to have product market fit before you start the company, essentially. So